Shabbat Shalom once again, everybody. So, we're just in that section of the Torah reading which talks about the children of Israel actually leaving Egypt after years, decades, centuries of bondage. So what we read this morning, it's the end of the Torah reading. They finally leave. Next week we're going to read about the crossing of the Red Sea. So the question is, why did our ancestors deserve to be redeemed from slavery in Egypt? I mean, in many times people have been slaves, and it wasn't God that redeemed them, but it was man that ultimately ended up ending slavery. So why here did God redeem the children of Israel from slavery? This week's Parashas Bo contains that sort of dramatic ending to the people's slavery in Egypt after the most horrible plague of the death of the firstborn. Every firstborn in Egypt, there wasn't a house, we're told, that didn't know of death. And what does Pharaoh do? He now summons Moses and Aaron and he tells them to get out. Go, leave. The Egyptians urged the people to get out immediately. As why? Because they feared their lives. They feared their lives, saying, we all will be dead. And so what happened? Our ancestors, they hurried out of town. They carried matzahs, they carried gifts, or perhaps some say it was plunder from the Egyptians. The Zohar teaches that the Israelites had reached the 49th gate of impurity. They had done so many wicked things that they were nearly as distant as possible as it can get to God. There are only 50 gates of impurity, according to Zoharic belief. If they had reached the 50th gate, all hope would have been lost, and there would have been no way that they could have been redeemed. If the people were so evil, committing so many sins, including idol worship, turning away from God, why then did God save them? Why were they worthy of that redemption? Now there's a very well-known midrash, which it turns out isn't really in the midrash. It's a mashup of a couple of different midrashim. But we'll go with the well-known version. And the well-known version is that the Israelites were led out of Egypt because they kept three things intact: their names, their clothing, and their language. In other words, they clung to their Jewish identity. They may have been horrible sinners in all sorts of ways, but they were Jewish sinners. And that alone was enough to merit God's salvation, presumably because of the merits of their ancestors and God's promise to their ancestors, to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. On the other hand, when Moses fled Egypt and arrived in Midian, he appeared as an Egyptian. He grew up in the Egyptian court. And no doubt he spoke Egyptian, whatever language it was they spoke in Egypt at that time. He dressed like an Egyptian. He acted like an Egyptian. So that when his future wife, Zipporah, first met him and went to tell her father of the encounter with Moses, she and her sisters told their father, an Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds and watered the flocks for us. Didn't say a Hebrew Egyptian or a Hebrew, but an Egyptian rescued us from shepherds and watered the flock for us. An Egyptian. The Torah says Pharaoh's daughter gave Moses his name. The Torah gives us a Hebrew etymology, but Moses was likely an Egyptian name. The Greek Jewish philosopher Philo pointed out Mo is water in ancient Egyptian. You know, there's a legend that says that Moses hid his identity as a Hebrew from his father-in-law, Jethro. And that's why when God tells him to go and take the people out, to go negotiate with Pharaoh and take the people out of Egypt, what does he do? He says, I need to go and speak with my father-in-law first and get his approval. It was only reconnecting with his Judaism when God appears to him at the burning bush. One of the markers of Jewish identity that even many secular Jews keep is circumcising their sons. Believe me, I know it. I do enough Milah. And I do a lot of Milah of people who don't keep anything else, but Milah is something that is so important to them. Moses didn't even do that. He didn't even have his sons circumcised. And when he set out on the road with his wife and son, he hadn't had a bris. Gershom, his son, needed the bris by Tzipporah. It was Moses tells Tzipporah to perform the emergency circumcision on the road, that he should be circumcised. So the question one has to ask is, why did Moses conceal his identity? I don't know. Maybe he was embarrassed. The Hebrews were slaves. The Egyptians were very powerful. Why appear to be part of a weak and oppressed nation when you can appear as part of a very strong and powerful nation? Maybe he felt it would improve his standing in the community, certainly in the eyes of the locals, give him a better chance at having a good wife, a successful career. Maybe he wanted to put his Jewishness behind him. The one time that he did stand up for his Jewish identity was when he killed the Egyptian taskmaster who was beating one of the Jews. And all that happened was, when he did that, he got into trouble and he had to run for his life. So Moses actually may have been the first Jew who went out of his way to hide his Jewish identity. But he certainly wasn't the last. Unlike many other minorities who can't do anything about the color of their skin, it's very, very easy. It's very easy for Jews to pass as part of the mainstream culture. And despite jokes about, funny, you don't look Jewish, the truth is that if you don't wear a kippah, or if you don't wear a Star of David, no one is going to know that you're Jewish by looking at you. And many of us, intentionally hide our Jewish identity, at least at times, and for many of the same reasons that Moses hid his identity. We may be embarrassed, feeling like we don't fit. There was an article this week, I don't know if you read it, about the BBC in England and the rabbi who had been serving the BBC for 30 years. He was a broadcaster, and he quit this year after 30 years because of anti-Semitism. And when he gave his interview, he said that regardless of the camaraderie, regardless of the politeness that I was shown, I didn't fit, and I knew I didn't fit. So we may be embarrassed, feeling like we don't fit. Children, I know, they say, all the other kids have Christmas trees, why don't we? Now maybe we hide our identity for professional reasons. We fear that being publicly Jewish could hurt our career progression. Do you know the leading Orthodox halachist in America in the 20th century was the late Moshe Feinstein, Zecher Tzaddik Livrocha. And you know what he said? He said that it's okay for Jews not to wear a kippah at work if they thought it might harm chances of promotion. Now, some Jews have wanted to leave their Jewishness behind them. I know of some Holocaust survivors who immigrated to Canada. And what did they do? They went out of their way to adopt a Goyish sounding name and became sort of quasi-Christians. Their children didn't even know they were Jewish until the parents were elderly. When confronted, the mother told her daughter, "Being Jewish caused us nothing but grief. We wanted an easy life for you." The daughter then returned to Judaism. I have it now with one of my students. I don't want to go into too much detail, but suffice it to say that he comes from an Arab land. And his grandmother, before her passing, intimated that she was Jewish. And his mother sort of confirmed their Jewish connections. But she begged him, she said, "If you're going to go the route of becoming fully Jewish, don't come back, because it won't be very well received, and I don't want anything to happen to you." Sometimes it's fear that makes us hide our identity. I know when I was a kid, growing up in London, I often hid my Jewishness because I was afraid of the local anti-Semitic bullies who would use it as excuse to beat me up and my friends. I used to wait on the corners when we would go in the morning to get the bus to go to school. But we lose something when we hide our identities, when we're not willing or able to be our true selves in public. It's totally understandable to hide one's Jewish identity in a time or place of danger. That's a long-standing Jewish tradition. The Talmud talks about things such as lighting your menorah away from the windows in times of persecution, even though the mitzvah is to publicize that miracle. If I were visiting Paris, I can assure you that I would not wear a kippah in certain neighborhoods. There's no point in making yourself a target. On the other hand, what's the impact on our psyches? What kind of example do we set for our children if we hide who we are just to fit in, or because it's just more convenient? You know, a recent and very disturbing survey from the Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law found that fully half of American college students hid their Jewish identities at least on a regular occasion. 1 in 5 said they sometimes or even often hide their Jewish identity on campus. Jewish students' campus experiences reinforces the perception that they may need to hide their Jewishness, their Jewish identity. Seniors are more likely than freshmen to say they sometimes feel unsafe on campus as a Jew, with a need to hide their identity. It's crazy. It's crazy that this happens on college campuses, where acceptance of diversity is a core belief. The very same students who protest calling COVID the Chinese virus, or who are upset when a US president calls African nations the sort of expletives that were used. Countries have no problem in calling Israel genocidal. They have no problem accusing Israel of ethnic cleansing. Our response, both on and off campus, should not be to hide our Jewish identity. Hiding our identity is never a long-term, successful strategy anyway. Hitler had no problem figuring out who had Jewish ancestors. Very simple to do. The Jewish people the Jewish people have contributed immensely to society. We should be very proud of our achievements, and we should be free to be proud of our Jewishness. We also need to be very careful about not being overly sensitive. And people are. They get overly sensitive. Not all criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. Not everyone who supports BDS is an anti-Semite, although many are. Engaging with our critics will, in the long run, benefit both ourselves and the world more than if we become insular and hide our identities. We are taught that the reason we bless our sons on Friday night with the blessing that they should be like Ephraim and Manasseh is because even though they grew up in the lap of luxury in Egypt, they always remained faithful to their Jewish names and their Jewish identity. And however unsafe we might feel, we certainly don't have it as bad as the children of Israel had in Egypt. And so, from this moment on, may we pledge to stand tall with our heads high, be proud of being a Jew and our Jewishness. Shabbat Shalom.